Welcome to Thought to Action, presented by Project Sentinel. Visit our website on projectsentinel.com. We're on X at PRJ_Sentinel and throughout social media. The term Civil War has been thrown around quite often since the mid-2010s. It's accelerated today. Perhaps people throw huger tantrums when they don't get their way after an election, or when a Supreme Court decision's made, or when legislation's passed that they don't like. The divide between many on the right or left and all around, all widening, or at least it seems so. So what would you call a civil war in the US, and what would it look like if something like that happens today? How close are we to anything like that, and how will it be fought? Our merry band of panelists are here to talk about it. First, we have Project Sentinel President Tony Shaffer and Lieutenant Colonel retired. Project Sentinel Chairman, Navy Captain retired Pete O'Brien. Project Sentinel Distinguished Fellows, Lieutenant Colonel Tim Wilson, British Army retired, and Ambassador and Cooper. I'm Chris Cordani, dealing the questions, and let's do this. Tony, let's start with you. First question. Sure. Civil war, a too often used statement among podcasters and clickbaiters, or something of which we should be wary?
No, I think the fundamental social and political issues which existed before the first Civil War exist now. You have cultural, political, and economic divides which are creating circumstance for a potential breakdown of society. So I was talking to, I was just at Rotary a few minutes ago. By the way, I'm wearing my Invasion Stripes shirt today. We're taping this on D-Day, the 80th anniversary, so I'm wearing. People who see these, by the way, the night before the invasion, they put all these black and white stripes on the aircraft flying over, so they knew not to shoot them down, just saying. So that's why I'm wearing it. But I was talking to a member of Rotary, and they were talking about first Civil War, because I told him we were taping this today. And he said, well, many of the issues that relate to the South had to do with economics. It wasn't just about slavery, it was about economics. It was about certain things that related to tariffs and a number of things that were at play regarding how will the industrialized North work with the agrarian South. And while we don't have that breakdown now in those terms, we do have a breakdown of social and economic constructs by the fact you have the blue cities, which largely dominate many states, where you have rural elements, agrarian and otherwise. I mean, I live in rural North Carolina. A lot of the economy here is agrarian. But our politics are a lot different than, say, Raleigh or Charlottesville, because there's a real presence of, I'm just going to say it, Marxist thinking that has embedded itself in the larger Democrat Party. So while we may break down between the Democrats and Republicans like the last Civil War, I think it'll be very much aligned in those terms. The conditions behind each party, the philosophy behind each party is very different. But no one has to go any further than look at NPR. I listen to NPR driving, and as I've told you all, I'm constantly trying to keep myself on the road because I'm rolling my eyes constantly at what they're saying. It's like, really? Because there's an alternate universe. There's an alternate sphere where facts are optional. To include the person who now runs NPR. She said facts get in the way of our being able to talk to each other. Really? I didn't know that. So if you carry that thinking on to the next level of action, hey, that's what we're on, right? Thought to action. If you carry on the thinking to action, then yeah, you're going to inevitably end up at some point where both sides are going to do things that result in a conflict. The question becomes, what does that conflict look like? And that's why we're here to talk about it. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a scene setter.
Gentlemen, what do you think here?
I think that we have a hint of what it would physically look like from riots over the last 50, 60 years.
Yeah.
I think people not getting their way and taking to the streets, and then that turning to looting, vandalism and violence, is a pretty good steer to how this might start and where it might start. And the frightening part for me is that the cities are so vulnerable. Although it's actually, I think, the rural areas that are suffering most under the policies that are going around and inflation at the moment. Gas prices really matter when you live out in the country. They matter less in a city where there tends to be some mass transit. But people out in the country are struggling with higher gas prices, and they're likely to keep going higher and higher and higher. And that also affects the delivery of goods. So then you get this divide, but at least in the country, many of us can hunt and hunt sufficiently to actually get by. Whereas the cities, if they actually devolve the way I suspect they might, food delivery stop, water, power goes off, most importantly, and water becomes scarce, the cities are going to have to empty out. And while they do, certain people are going to take advantage and start the looting again.
There's one more thing that I would add to what Tony said that is somewhat similar, different in detail, but that is the, you want to call it a debate or a division of view about legislative authorities between the states and the federal government.
Yeah.
And that is a major problem today. And it's cast along Republican Democrat lines to some degree, to a major degree, in fact. And the other thing is the overlay of the legacy of the last 60 years or so, in which our school systems have abandoned, I'll call it Judeo-Christian heritage and thinking, which now leaves us with young people who are susceptible to arguments that are contrary to those who wrote our Constitution.
If I can jump in, I agree with what's been said so far by my three colleagues, but let me try and take a more basic view. Because I think there are a whole host of reasons that might essentially trip us off from where we are right now into some sort of really violent across the nation kind of confrontation. But I think we need to look at the violence that we've seen in riots in cities, et cetera, and say it's going to be different than that, because if it just decays into a series of inner city riots, basically the police can handle that. The question where things go sideways, the issue when things go sideways, is if someone starts hitting infrastructure. If someone hits a series of major bridges across the country, or they hit power grids across the country, or something along those lines, such that there are serious, if you will, deficiencies in the day-to-day running of our cities, and in a number of cities across the country, so that you can't say, well, things are bad in Philadelphia, but everybody else is doing okay. If it's just one city, it doesn't really matter. What happens, things go sideways when what happens in one city is mirrored in dozens of other cities. And so there would have to be some sort of organization someplace, or some kind of response, some kind of hive mentality, if you will, where something goes sideways. Someone hits the power grid, for example, and you get a whole series of folks hitting those power grids, and order breaks down. Once that happens, once you have a failing of, if you will, the system of systems that is a modern country, particularly a large modern country, things snowball quickly. There's a waterfall effect, if you will. A large city, even a medium-sized city, can survive for perhaps 2 or 3 days with nothing coming in. But beyond that 2 or 3 days, things break down very quickly. There is very little food. Turn the power off in New York City and wait a couple of days, and most of the buildings in New York City will have no water. If you're the average person who's living above about 30 floors up, you need to leave. And now take a look at a lot of our cities. How many people in those cities have no mass transportation, or have cars that they don't keep full of gas? etc. And you have a whole host of um, traffic management issues. If you try to evacuate New York City, tell everybody to leave. Most people won't get up,
Right.
because you get a gigantic traffic jam and they run out of gas and then they're stuck.
Unless
And
they
no
know
one's
how
going
to
to walk
swim.
away from New
Right.
York City.
Right.
We actually saw that happen, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago in New York.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So you wind up with these organizational and structural issues, and then on top of that, you then wind up with, one side of the if you will, one side of the traffic essentially blaming the other side, and then the violence starts. So one of the things that is fundamentally different today than 160 years ago is that we have these very complex, very dependent cities, and if something happens, those cities break down very quickly, and this gets very ugly very fast.
Yeah.
It's
So
not only the cities, Pete. I'm sitting here looking out at the farm where I grew up, and when I grew up, there were farms all around here, and it was still agricultural. This is in South Carolina, and if you could find 2 farms in this county,
Right.
I would be surprised.
Right.
yeah.
Operating farms. So you lose the electricity, as you mentioned, and you lose the ability to transport goods. We don't grow our food anymore. When I was a boy, that wouldn't have bothered us from the point of view of survival as a family, because I picked up the eggs and I milked the cows, and we could live for a long time without any external help. We wouldn't have any money, but we didn't have very much money anyway.
Yeah.
Now I'm 10 miles from a metropolitan center, that people can get out of, and whatever little things we may have is a target for those who are hungry, and it's a dangerous situation all around. It's not just the cities.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. Is that essentially what happens here? I think there would be a very long, ugly transition where it would not be really a civil war. It would be just chaos. It would be this sort of mass anarchy. After the anarchy, you're going to, eventually every society self-organizes. You're going to have a rise of a series of factions, but there's going to be a period in there of perhaps several months. I don't know. No one knows of this really ugly, violent chaos.
Yeah. Well, I think that's part of the objective, by the way, of others who are not us. And let me clarify that. Part of, I think, our problem, and that's why you see things like TikTok and other technologies which can be used to amplify messages, are so much, being used by a lot of folks to include our adversaries. I think TikTok is a very sophisticated information warfare weapon that the Chinese developed, and it's having a great effect. And so I don't believe for the minute the Chinese want to take us on head on regarding military force on force. But if a civil war started, who would benefit? Well, they would benefit. Russia would benefit. A number of nations would benefit if we are focused so vigorously internally to resolve our issues. We can't do anything else. And I think that's part of why you see some of this social unrest and divisions growing, because I think foreign adversaries want it to happen. I think they want to have that chaos internally that frees them up from having to worry about anything we might do. So a civil war may look like, a lot of foreign influence coming in to kind of stoke those fires of division. You guys just talked about centers of gravity. Power grids are critical to the digital age. I mean, we could not be talking right now if not for abundant source and inexpensive, even though it's more expensive now, abundant and inexpensive energy. My bill is about $300 to $400 a month. It's not small, but it's, I have to afford it because I have to. And I think most Americans feel that way. But if you take that away in certain areas, you create conditions where society breaks down and very rapidly. And I think that's, again, what an adversary wants. They want that internal strife, that internal division, internal chaos,
And
so
by
they don't
the
have to worry
way,
about
that
it.
adversary, yeah, that adversary is not just China. We tend to focus on China
We
as the
do.
big threat. The Middle East represents nations in the Middle East and what's going on right now in the conflict with Hamas.
Yeah.
Not just Hamas, Hezbollah, and other um, clients of Iran. You know, that can turn sour in this country too. It's not just over there.
Well,
Yep.
so all of your points, the idea here is, and I think I'm following you, Tony, on this, is that a foreign influence or some agitators could come into this country, and by the way, it's easy for them to get in, find a bunch of gullible Antifa LARPers, have them gather a few armies and destroy the power grid or destroy city
Well,
infrastructures.
no, I
they
think
did,
it's
like they were
more.
doing
It's
during
more
the
than
St.
that.
Floyd riots,
No,
right? But that's a part of it. I'm just saying
that could be part of it.
you can
Yeah.
find a bunch of gullible people to start this, and then people could tag on, and this is where it could blow up from there.
Yeah, well, literally. But yes, the centers of gravity and our vulnerabilities as a country are well known to our adversaries. Our adversaries could find a very inexpensive vector, like you mentioned, Chris. Those who already hate us, who live here, or through very sophisticated cyber or other direct attacks on the infrastructure, you could see some damage. And to that point, you could have any major state expanded the states to Hank's concept. The idea has been in the past that somehow the military would come to the aid of the states if there's a mass and continuous blackout. Well, that's not true if the military is depending on the same backbone as civilians are, which we do. We used in the old days, back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, had each military installation had its own redundant power source. It could generate its own power. Coal fired mostly. It's gone. Now the entire defense infrastructure depends on the private sector, and if the private sector goes down, so does defense. And so there's no cavalry coming. Which then again, if that happens, who then becomes the defenders of the country? So I think we'd have to recognize that a number of areas which are fundamentally more prepared to be resilient, like Hank mentioned, where I live, we thought about this. We have a number of folks who believe we're a small county. We've got about 14,000 people. We think we could come through pretty good. So, I'm just saying.
Well, there's a number of possible triggers, as you rightly say, but there's also a number of knock-on effects that people don't realize. We talk fairly, not glibly, that's the wrong word, but easily about, a power somewhere really changing things up. Knock-ons to the power failure is, of course, communication failures and internet failures.
Right.
Cell phones go down. We saw that in New York, Hank's example, 15 odd years ago. And if that happens, suddenly the communication structure breaks down. Potentially the financial structure also breaks down.
Of course.
Goods then stop flowing into the city because people aren't going to get paid for driving them in, and they're not going to get paid for delivering them. That's when, starvation has always been the great trigger of civil unrest. We don't see starvation in this country. It's a very, very rare thing. But the potential is always there, and the cities are incredibly vulnerable to, a cessation of services resulting in, as you say, the stores in most big cities have 2-3 days of supplies, no more.
Well, they'll be looted inside of a day anyway. That's what's going to happen.
Yep.
That's number one. And I'm sure, like Ambassador Cooper said, some of them will be migrating outward into the suburban areas that are surrounding the cities and victimize them or loot those areas as well.
But that's the point I wanted to get to is should we have these political and social and cultural divides become economic divides that create conditions for people don't have food, don't have fuel, that becomes an issue of society breaking down. And that can be caused by the differences. And then people are going to choose sides. And this is my point. You'd potentially have a situation where those who have guns, I'm just going to say it, those who have guns and some level of training and preparation are going to be those who self-organize rapidly to figure out how to do this. And Hank, you mentioned earlier that the 10th Amendment issue of states versus federal. We've looked at that here. I advise Sheriff Dave DeCavert in Stafford County regarding this issue about what should he do as a sheriff versus deal with the federal government, because that's going to become something very important. Oh, by the way, the federal government doesn't really exist. It does, but it doesn't. Federal government has no real ability to generate resources other than those they already have regarding partnerships in states. The federal government has to exist within the world we exist in, and so I would argue if you have a situation where there's a have and have not situation, people with guns, whether they're part of the government or not, are going to self-organize. And oh, by the way, there's more people with guns in the private sector than there are in the government. And so I know everybody talks about the IRS and all these other things being armed. When you've got over 400 million guns, and most of those, the vast majority, in the hands of civilians, you're going to quickly see organizing along the lines of survival. So yeah, we could see something break down where people just practically get together and figure it out.
Tony, that's where the National Guard could come in to
Yes.
in a very serious and constructive way.
Right.
They belong to the state government.
Exactly.
The problem with that, Hank, is that they also belong to their local area.
Yep.
Yes.
If they don't agree with the state governors, because
That's where the armories are.
blame the state governors. There's an interesting film that Tony pointed me towards a few days ago called Civil War 2024. That seems to very much form to the opinion that Washington goes mad and the Civil Guard, the National Guard from Texas and California effectively combines along with everything in the middle to go and take out the administration. And I'm sat thinking, there's an element of truth to that, but this is a country which is not bipolar, but certainly a two-party state, potentially more. And how do you identify within your own group which side people are going to be on? The Civil War back in 1860, was a very different thing. That was fought largely between big conscript but regularized armies. Anything that we're talking about, I think, is going to be much more local, much more, my town, my people, my family, my tribe. And most of the National Guard does not come from big cities.
Oh, that's an interesting point. Will this Civil War, if something happens like that in America, it wouldn't be two organized armies of like in the old one, where the North and South were fighting for a specific cause. This could be tribal sets of different ideologies, or the ideologies in different areas, just kind of duking it out in different places. So that leads me to my next question. And this is where we saw that. Were we seeing something of a preview of what a civil war could look like, at least in the urban areas of the U.S., through the Antifa and St. Floyd riots of the late 2010s and 2020? Of course, St. Floyd being the 2020, but the Antifas beforehand.
I firmly believe so. I do believe it's a damn good idea for everybody today to get a feel for what might come, or at least what might be the trigger to the whole thing.
Yeah, if I can jump in here, I go back to the idea that what's going to happen, if something is going to happen, and I pray it does not, is what you're going to start off with is this sort of general chaos. It's going to be just a lot of nondescript violence by local groups that just kind of get out of, they see an opportunity to loot and burn, etc., and they will. But then what happens is that as something happens, there's going to be at some point there would be an event or a series of events that would start to damage infrastructure. The infrastructure systems start falling apart, and that's when we get organizational collapse.
Yep.
And in following that, what you're going to see is the rise of self-forming organizations. So the gunmen, the riflemen, the farmers and riflemen in Western Kentucky all get together and form some sort of coalition or something, and they'll, they divvy out responsibilities. They form a small army, and they start matching up with, their neighboring groups. And at a certain point here, what ostensibly would happen is that those those various groups would develop a philosophy, a direction that they're headed. And when you really get into the problem area is when you have I'll make this up. The group from Tennessee and Kentucky bump into the group from Illinois, and the group from Illinois is going in a completely different direction philosophically and politically than is the group from Kentucky and Tennessee. And now we degrade into a real, honest to God, intertribal war.
Well, part of that is, of course, that we're relying on the police to restore order in the cities. They won't be able to, so they'll call in. Presumably, they'd call in the National Guard. The National Guard can't necessarily handle things that well. And then we've got, meanwhile, in Washington, what is the president doing with the regular army, which nobody expects to deploy in this country, but might. And, especially politicians who don't really know what they're talking about have this tendency to say, well, I'll just call up the army and we'll enact special powers and we'll let the army solve it. Not realizing a very valid point that Tony made earlier, which is that the private sector has 100 times we know that the military and police combined and law enforcement of this country combined have about 9 million weapons. The private sector has 400 million.
Right.
The military have several billion rounds. The private sector has hundreds of billions of rounds. So, and the Afghanistan lesson is valid, as is the George Floyd and Antifa riots. Unless you're actually willing to machine gun hundreds of people at a time, you can't deal with what is effectively a nationwide insurgency.
It's an interesting thing too, and one of those bizarre, only the Army would come up with this. But an Army rule of thumb planning guidance is that when you occupy a piece of terrain, and this is just starting. This is a starting point for your planning. It may go up, it may go down, but your starting point for planning, I was told by an Army colonel years ago, is 1%. So if you have a population of 1 million, you start off with an assumption you're going to need about 10,000 people to control it. 10,000 soldiers. This isn't counting support troops. This is soldiers. I need 10,000 guys with guns on the ground to control a population of 1 million. Now, if they're acquiescing in your occupation, it may turn into be less than that. If they turn into an insurgency, it's going to be more than that. But you start off with a general rule of thumb of 1% of soldiers. Now, if you say that about the United States, 330 million people, you would start off with a rule of thumb of I need 3.3 million soldiers. Well, how many soldiers are there in the U.S. Army? 500,000. It very quickly, when you start looking at this, is the numbers don't exist for the federal government, for the U.S. Army, for the Pentagon to harumph and say, well, we're going to send the U.S. Army out and stabilize the nation. It ain't going to happen. They don't have enough bodies.
And the other part of that is the same problem that happened during the Civil War. You take a regular army unit, and who is it loyal to? Where's it from? Where are the unit from? Unit cohesion tends to fall apart, at least for a short while, because people have their loyalties back to their own tribes, their own locations.
Yep.
This leads us to another question, because we've seen an ideological civil war running around. You've seen it in the culture. You've seen it through politics. You heard Maxine Waters tell people to harass supporters of Donald Trump, and call you've seen politicians call for unrest when it came to the Floyd situation. So, weapons or otherwise, would a civil war in America be fought with weaponry and fisticuffs, or in rows, or would it be fought by seeing battles on other grounds, like cultural, the use of lawfare, informational, giving people the what for, if you will? That's what the kids say, giving people the what for, and business-wise through goods and services. Whereas some are denied goods and services, others are. I'm sure you see people denied work because of their ideology at this point. Thoughts on that?
Well, I'll just jump in. As I mentioned in the beginning, I think we're on that slope right now. We're on the path because we do have a cultural war. The divisions are such that one side does not recognize that the other side is human. Literally, I mean, there are those I see it on Twitter every day, on X. how those who hate Trump and the conservative side don't believe there should be any quarter given. I think we've always been the more reasonable side, just saying that is the side of common sense and reasonableness, because I include my friends who are traditional liberals in this too. The free speech, free thought, people who recognize the right of the other to have a different opinion. The other side right now doesn't believe you have the right of different opinions. Fauci has done that. Fauci shut down everybody regarding that. The Russia collusion narrative regarding the entire federal bureaucracy. Right now, you've got an effort to support sleepy Joe Biden, to pretend that even the Wall Street Journal is questioning, reporting on him being hobbled and unable to make decisions as being attacked by the left. And, they're just telling the truth. And we all see it. We saw it today during his speech in Normandy. He got things factually wrong. He called the M4 tank an M4 tractor. That's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, these things aren't hard, but then they accumulate. So my belief is, if we continue with the cultural divisions as they are, it will inevitably spark into a civil war, because you're going to have elements which become so adamant about hating the other that hate will become something else. And everybody says, oh, it could never happen here. Gee, I'm sure the Romans felt that way too, about Rome burning and everything. I'm sure the Romans all thought, oh no, it could never happen here. It could happen here. I think that's what we have to recognize.
I want to throw this out to the rest of you then. The idea is, like you said, Tony, people think, oh, that's never going to happen, because we don't think like that. We're people who wouldn't do such a thing.
Yeah.
I mean, unless otherwise seriously provoked, but that's a different story. This is why when America tries to impose values or jump into wars and things like that around the world, we try to say, well, if we would do this, or we wouldn't do this, why would we think other people are going to do this, or other nations, when they don't realize, they don't look at what the other side might do. And you're right. There are people in this country who have denied other people work, who do deny services. And we actually saw a friend of ours, it happened to, had a concert canceled because she spoke out about something. This is the kind of thing we're seeing not only in this nation, but around the world. It's an ideological civil war, and it could be fought in many other ways, and with different effects in different portions. Let's say rural, like was brought up earlier today, suburban and urban. So there are many layers of this, and who wins, that could be regional as well.
Yeah, absolutely right. One of the things that we're, I think, all dancing around is the possibility that jailing a political opponent is always a move that can go either way.
Exactly.
Successfully used by the Chinese for a long time. The Russians have done it for a long time. For it to be even apparently happening here is truly, to me, terrifying and of deep concern. Although I do like the idea that Donald Trump in his orange jumpsuit could run his campaign from his jail cell in the same way that Joe Biden runs his from his basement.
There are certain factions of this country, and that ideology seems to fall the same way, to be honest with you, that have taken to and have performed the action of jailing, imprisoning, or finding another way to curtail a freedom or two of their political opponents.
I do find it also interesting that on the media we've had people calling for the demise, the physical terminal demise of Donald Trump.
Right.
That when Tony was talking about how we on the other side behave, I haven't heard anybody in anywhere calling for the demise of our current president.
That's because they think he's already dead.
Yeah, and the fact that look what happens if he's gone. That's the other one. I mean, think about it. President Harris. Do you ever want to say that in your life?
So, speaking of Harris, did you know that she's going to be our rep, the U.S. rep, to the so-called peace conference in Geneva on the 15th, the World Peace Conference? Zelensky is showing up in his best green outfit, and they're going to talk peace. Of course, the Russians aren't included, so I don't know what peace they're going to talk about, but I'm sure... just saying, I'm sure Harris knows all about pieces. Just saying.
Isn't she going to demand that Israel surrender?
Well, Israel should have a ceasefire, because a ceasefire is a good thing. And when you cease to fire, that would require a ceasefire, which means there would be a fantastic ceasefire if we decide that we all must fire and continue, or not continue the firing, because then we can cease of all of that and thus come up with a ceasefire.
Genius. Genius.
Yeah, you need to apply to be her next speechwriter, Chris.
I think
you
so.
do
I think
well.
I can do. I can.
You got it. You've got it down.
I'm awesome. I could do it. I could
Let's
definitely.
let's.
do it.
Can you get Willie Brown on the line and have him comment about her lingual skills? Can we do that sometime?
Oh boy, I think we can try that. I'm sure.
Let's ask Mayor Willie about her
I'm sure if we kneel
oral
down and beg,
arguments.
he might listen,
Yes.
but it's a different story.
Yes.
Oh, let's pull it back here because there's one more question that's pertinent to this as well. The notion of a national divorce has been tossed around. I'm not saying I'm advocating this. I'm just throwing it out to all of you and our viewers. So I would like to hear your comments about this. And by the way, if you enjoy us, subscribe to us on Project Sentinel's YouTube channel or on our Rumble channel, because we love to talk to you and hear what you think about that as well.
We
And
do.
what we do.
Absolutely.
Well, this national divorce idea has been tossed into American discourse as well. But it was Abraham Lincoln who said, paraphrasing, a nation divided could not stand. George Costanza said, a George divided cannot stand. The fact is the national divorce a viable plan or a silly idea? And how do we avoid something like that if people really think they're trying to pull this off? I mean, we're technically interdependent on each other as states in that respect.
I think I'll jump in as the immigrant and say legal and say that a national divorce is a silly idea, but the idea that's going on out in the far west at the moment of a greater Idaho, where people in Washington and Oregon states have had enough of the big cities telling them how to live. I don't see anything wrong with that. I don't see where in the Constitution it said the states are as they are today and never shall change.
That could change some dynamics because Idaho then gets a couple of extra electoral votes. Let's say California tries to pull off the plan that some of the people in Eastern California want. They want to break away from coastal California. Now you make 3 states, 2 of those, one will probably swing red and one purple. All of a sudden, now you have a real situation there too. And the Democrats really, especially in California, they hate the idea because they know the coast has the population centers and they control a whole load of electoral votes. By the way, counting down, if you will.
Yeah, partitioning a state can only be done by Congress per the Constitution. The one pseudo exception when Texas was brought into the Union, there was an agreement. I something in the back of my mind tells me that it timed out. There was an agreement that Texas had an option to split into 5 states, but they never did, obviously. But other than that, it has to be done by Congress. Congress has to bless any kind of reshaping of a state. But be that as it may, it doesn't mean they can't. I mean, I think there's a great deal of merit to the idea that what's going on in northwestern Washington State is almost unknown. It's terra incognita to the rest of the state. The rest of the state is, if you will, very red, and northwest Washington State is very blue. And why did they have to be together?
It makes a lot of sense. It was Article 4, Section 3 of the Constitution says that a state cannot divide and form smaller states without congressional approval. The funny thing is, this is, as you said, this is not happening. It's a state breaking off and going to another. That's not necessarily a divide.
Well, it's counties moving
into separate states.
Moving the counties into a different state. I don't think that's congressional approval as far as I can tell, Pete.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, where Pete lives, he'd be better off in North Carolina because his part of Virginia is red.
Right. But I can't imagine that as if you will, inattentive as Congress often is, sadly. I think if someone tried to do this, that Congress would harumph. Congress would say,
they will. It would affect their seats and their power base and all the rest. Right. But that doesn't mean they have any constitutional power to intervene.
Yeah, but they have a budgetary power to intervene, so they would.
Well, that's why I think the states need to really take back the the power of the purse from the federal government. I think all taxes should go through the states. The states should have to be the ones to collect it and give it to the federal government. The states would recognize how much money is wasted if they're the ones like passing it through. I believe this is radical. I'm just going to say it. I think part of the fix is to make sure that states are the centerpiece of most financial transactions regarding governance. Most. Let the states fight. The idea of us fighting the federal government is insane. Let the states fight on our behalf. Let the states collect the taxes, and then they give they collect it on to benefit the state in our lives. Federal government does very little to benefit anybody's lives. All they use is the resources to benefit politicians. Politicians use those resources as a form of entitlement to those who basically support them. We need to stop that. The states should be the ones who are the conduit for all that.
Tax day ought to be October 31st. So that, several days after you send taxes off, you pay the man, you get to vote.
Yeah. There you go.
That would be perfect. That's a good idea. Then, of course, it runs in a holiday season, so you might have to push some of that back because nobody's going to have any money by then. That's another story, though.
but that's just the point. They would be madder and hornets.
Right.
I like it. But look, it's true. This is one of the cruxes of a potential civil war is the way the government is spending money like it's crazy and printing money like it's crazy. We have an economic situation where, yes, we know the president lied about Bidenomics and Bidenflation, but the fact is we have it, and the only way that these people are sending money to these other countries and then forgiving student loan debt is not with the money we have and not with the backing of the Federal Reserve, but by printing more money and making that dollar weaker, which doesn't help anybody. And that results in another tax, technically, because inflation itself from the printing of money would be that tax charged to the rest of us citizens. And that's another issue.
We're seeing, and don't forget that the deficit leads to interest payments, which interest payments, a lot of people seem to believe that the government is paying interest to itself. They're not.
No.
They are paying out to treasury yields. And that means that a lot of that money is going abroad, never mind staying in the US. And that reduces the amount the government has to spend on essential services like national defense. And it's a spiral that goes on and gets worse all the time. And as with Social Security due to crash in 2035, many other things are going to crash around that time or before.
The mentality is they have the money for it. That's what they're thinking up in Washington. I believe didn't the president say that people can afford this? They have the money for it. Has he been outside? Outside of his little entourage, have any of these politicians been outside of their or most of these politicians?
No, I mean,
their little pushy powers.
Chris, he's got an unlimited supply of Depends undergarments and tapioca pudding. He's happy.
And ice cream cones. Don't forget the ice cream cones.
Vodka flavored ice cream from Nancy Pelosi. Absolutely.
There we go. And I'm sure he can get hammered using those. But anyway, that's a different story for a
So you asked me that earlier, Chris. What does a civil war look like? It looks like Nancy Pelosi's eyes after a 2-day bender.
That sounds rough. That sounds like what happened to oh gosh.
Yeah.
That sounds like Hiroshima. I mean, that's horrible.
Being boring, I would just say it looks horrible. And
You're talking about her breath now. Her breath is like Hiroshima.
Oh, this is bad. Now we're spiraling downward. We had a nice conversation. Now we're
I know I had to ruin it.
But that's all good because that's a lot of fun, and it does show that we do have to finish this one up and wrap it up. But any final thoughts on the ideas of a civil war and maybe how to kind of bring this discourse back to normal?
Well, if I can just chime in, I think one of the things, and my colleagues have all hit on this, one of the things that could trip off essentially the chaos that would then essentially grow into a real war is an economic crunch, a hard economic crunch, and there's all sorts of ways that can happen, but really it's a function. I had read an interesting article. I don't remember the man's name the other day. He was talking about how the Fed tries to manage the economy, and that it has become very sophisticated in the software that it uses to monitor the economy and respond. But as he said, there's an error rate. And right now, the error rate is something that the system can detect and respond to, but the problem is that the initial actions by the Fed take place when something happens, some sort of crisis. Who knows how it starts? When a crisis starts, the Fed responds. The system is becoming more and more automated, and the response is becoming faster and faster, deliberately so, because the faster the response, the less of a problem any particular crisis turns into. So they want to respond quickly to keep things under control. The problem is there is a small percentage of events out there which are not clearly defined. This is a black swan sort of thing, that the system would respond quickly but respond incorrectly, and would actually exacerbate the crisis. And so you wind up with one of these situations where 99 times out of 100 the system responds, the Fed responds, and things are good. That 100th time, it responds in it's the wrong thing, and the consequences are dramatic. And all of a sudden, you're on the toboggan run downhill as this gigantic global economy that is the United States starts to crumble. And once that happens, you're going to wind up with chaos, and from the chaos, you could very easily wind up with a civil war.
So let me say that something to add to that. So the moment our currency ends being the fiat currency of the world, that is the currency used for all energy transactions primarily, the moment we hit a hard economic stop, and the value of our dollar drops. And I think if you combine that economic catastrophe with the other real and distinct cultural and political differences, you've got the final ingredients that are needed for a civil war.
It's important to know that if that happens, there's no place else to go, because everybody else is going down. If the U.S. economy cracks that way, cracks hard, everybody else pays the piper too.
Yep.
That's correct.
Nobody wins, but the other side doesn't understand that.
Yeah,
But they don't care. They don't care about.
They don't care.
Well, I mean, this is if I can throw in a literary reference. This is Milton's Satan sitting on an ash heap saying, better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. That's the mentality here. Is ruin this thing, but at least we'll be in charge. That's a terrifying perspective.
That's why they keep poking the bear. Hank and I have spoken a little bit about this before. It's like they're antagonizing the Russians because they think somehow, nuclear war, no big deal. We'll come through it. It's like, no.
Well, that's part of
They
the
don't get it.
population
Don't get
agenda, and that's another story
don't get
altogether.
it.
That's something we should discuss as well.
Yeah.
But that's how that works. Tim, any final thoughts?
I just once again say civil war would be so horrible. People cannot appreciate. I've seen civil war in places like Bosnia, South Africa, various other places. We do not want to go there. We do not even want to go near it. It's such a terrible thing. And look back at the history of our own civil war. Record numbers of people died in that. Whole communities were decimated. People don't understand how bad war is unless you've actually been in one. You have no clue of just how bad it will be. And the people that go out rioting and what have you, they think they're going to gain something from it. No, they're going to help destroy everything for everybody. It ends up at the lowest common denominator.
Well, those rioters, many of them, the spoiled white Antifa types, those are LARPers. Those are live action role players. They think it's pretty cool and nifty to go out there, go on 7 and 1 and beat up senior citizens out there and loot buildings because it's fun. And it's like a live action Grand Theft Auto they think they're playing. And that's another dangerous aspect of society.
It'll be fun for them until they come out into the countryside and they try to mug an old guy who then pulls his 45 and ends them.
That's right.
Or
That's
punches
right.
one of them in the nose because my father always said one day they're going to approach the wrong guy. That's it. Wrong person.
So
In the city, out in the country, quite common.
The left is not necessarily the brightest bulb in the political chandelier. I mean, it took them 6 years to figure out Portlandia was a parody of them. I mean, it was just like they're making fun of us. We don't like it. So.
Crybabies. Ambassador Cooper, any final thoughts on the situation here?
It's the most dangerous period in my lifetime, and I remember World War II. This
Well,
is
there we go.
worse than World War II.
Well, that about sums it up. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We're going to be having more of these discussions. You can check them out on our YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe it and comment. We want to hear what you think about it, whether we're on YouTube with us or you're on our website, projectsentinel.com. You find us on X. That's at project _ Sentinel. We're going to be broadcasting this on X as well. And yes, throughout social media. Again, we have plenty of things happening in the future. And check our discussions from the past. We've covered a lot of issues. That's on our Project Sentinel YouTube channel and, of course, our Rumble channel. Thank you to our merry band of panelists, and thanks again for viewing and or listening if you're on the audio section of our podcast. Have an excellent day and stay informed.